Excellent. It's a very good question. And I think that what you need to think about, in Irish we call it Gaeilge Éigeantach, compulsory Irish. And the debate about compulsory Irish is a very important one. Just to give you context, I think that the cultural revival movement of the late 19th century is very, very important in understanding the formation of the new Irish state. It's a moment of intense cultural activity with men and women writing, publishing pamphlets, exchanging essays, producing works. This is the Irish revival, roughly from about 1890 to 1910 is its intense period. Why was it said? There is a very famous essay by the first president of Ireland, Douglas the Heather, on replacing English with Irish. You have to understand what lay behind Creven Even, Douglas the Hyde's essay. English had been imposed on Ireland in a number of ways. At one time, you wore a stick around your neck and you put a notch in it every time you used an Irish word. And when you went to school the following day, you were punished on the basis of the number of marks on the stick. And then again, I remember as well, even in my time when I was in active politics, people referred to the Irish language, people referred to English as what you needed for the boat, what you needed for the boat, because our people had to learn English to go abroad because of the migrants. So that's the background why people said then we will restore in many ways it created a mythology that suited they'd drawn from ancient times and that you could in fact put it into place and so on. I think myself that it was a mistake. I think that the essay might have been, I understand how it came to be written, but I don't agree with it. For the very reason Hyde himself, for example, spoke 5 languages, including he was very influenced by Hebrew and how it had been brought back. But he also spoke, his wife was German, he spoke at least 5 that I know of. So then what happened then, I think, was very interesting. At one stage, another of my predecessors, I think it's in Eamon de Valera's time as Prime Minister, Taoiseach, we would say, a number of all the state servants changed their names into Irish, and as if that was going to revive the subject. And I actually wrote a poem about that one time called Revivalist, which I couldn't publish when I was Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. But you then move on, and where are we now? Our issue now is not basic knowledge, because it is taught in all the primary schools, which I think is very good. You also have some schools at second level, which are all Irish. They teach all the subjects through Irish. I myself would have learned Latin and Greek, for example, through Irish, and all of the subjects at different stages. And then I'm not a native speaker, but when I was in England, there's a gap in my use of Irish. When I was in America, the same. But I represented my constituents, which are about 30% at one stage. Irish was their first language every day. And I was speaking a radio in a Gaeltacht in the morning at 8 o'clock, and also I'm the minister responsible for the establishment of the Irish television service, teaching Cahar now it is Rad Television at Gaeilge. All of this, what I'm really saying is, I'm in favour of Maragutme. I'll say it in Irish first because it's easier for me. Maragutme, kind of Undínia Valad and Changa, encouraging people, bringing people to the language rather than forcing it. And let us say the language, the television service that I established between 93 and 97, which is now going strong. The reason was I said, give the language a second chance, because they had been taught in a rather authoritarian way in some occasions, and people had a bad experience. So therefore I would say, give it another chance. So you would see everything in Irish, you see the subjects in English and so forth. And in many ways, if you're asking me, it's a long answer given to a question, but it was worth it, I think, for to answer you properly. And that is, if you said to me, you must encourage and lure people to the language, make the language attractive. The language also needn't stand for every antiquated, authoritarian idea that was ever dreamed up and imagined. the ancient Irish were people, for example, who, in relation to if you were unhappy in your marriage, you walked several times around your partner and you said, I'm off. So the point about it is that the language is never, unfortunately, at different times. I do remember people foisted onto the language attitudes that really had nothing to do with the essential Irish spirit. It is a language of life, and thankfully it's been spoken more and more and more by young people. And I am really pleased to see the significance that is given to the Maori culture and to the fact that the welcome in the public space. It's in the public space it must be recognised, and that's good. I think, again, another wonderful question in a way, because this is what I mean by the European street. Noted that I quoted Raymond Williams' article, "Be the arrow, not the target." That is for participatory, active culture rather than being a passive consumer of homogenized product. I remember the French president, Mitterrand, once said that some of the finest films in the world were made in the United States, but it was unreasonable to suggest that all films of the world that would be seen by Europeans would come from a small corner of the west coast of the United States. And I myself, as culture minister, had this debate with Jack Valenti and others. And I used to remind him, for example, of the new wonderful black film directors in Harlem and places like that, which, because he represented West Coast filmmaking, heterogeneity is an essential part. That is, what would a European culture be like? It would be informed by some basic ideas in relation to democracy, in relation to discourse. I think very often, what I think should have happened, remember now about the European Union in a way, it didn't deal with culture in the founding treaties. First of all, it had a bad experience with the abuse of culture as an ocean through fascism. It also assumed that the Council of Europe would deal with culture. And then a number of times as it came up when I myself was attending council meetings, people thought the culture was something you should keep close to education at home. So therefore it was an ideal matter for subsidiarity. What I think people need to do, what is very, very wonderful would be the idea that there are core values in relation to equality, rights, participation, gender equality, respect for the environment. We in Ireland gained from our membership of the European Union in relation to equality of men and women, in relation to the environment, in relation to fair wages, all of this. But the values got lost in a way, because I think the Lisbon Treaty, when you look at the history of the treaties, remember it had two great principles, competitiveness and cohesion. Cohesion got lost along the way, in my view. And thus, I think that at the time of the crisis recently, it was something very un-European to hear some nations speaking of other nations with language that was simply not the language of a union. I had discussed this with the President of Italy. I've discussed it with heads of state in other countries in Europe. And we are all of the same mind, that the language wasn't generous. And therefore, I think as well, it has been called spade spade. If you're talking about a union, you're talking about all of the members sharing the possibilities going forward together. You're not talking about a hegemon, and you're not talking about a hegemon and chief acolyte. You're talking about all of the countries of the European Union with shared values moving forward together. And what people in South America, Asia, elsewhere, when they look at the European Union, and they're very positive, they want a region that could be exemplary in relation to rights, decent work, eliminating poverty, participating internationally in the best interests, if you like, of global security and that. Really the idea that you somehow or another patch together a union as a kind of a complement to a set of fiscal arrangements isn't really sufficient to restore confidence. And I think that the conversation with the European street is the thing that has to be restored. You cannot abandon those who didn't participate in growth, those who didn't participate in income, and those who are unemployed, and particularly the young unemployed in so many of the states, and abandon them to a discourse that is xenophobic, potentially racist, and so on. That's why, in my speeches, I've been mentioning about, in the same way as literacy was important to parliamentarism across Europe, the new fiscal and economic literacy, making this real realm accountable and participatory by publics, is where you will in fact parliament. I've spoken to the European Parliament, to the Parliamentary Assembly, the Council of Europe, and I said to them, if you allow these decisions to be leached out of Parliament and out of the parliamentary discourse onto the spaces where they will be abused, there will be a terrible price to be paid for it. And I totally agree with you, when people of your age and the rest of it, is you can make, Europe can in fact actually be that region. But so also can the other regions around the world in ways. But culture in the end, it's not a matter of what it's, I think if you asked us, those of us, small countries like us, I make many invitations to people to examine what I call the ethics of memory, and following Paul Ricoeur and Hannah Arendt and others like that. The hardest journey many people have is in relation to empire examining its conscience, and tendencies to domination being made critical, and people examining the consequences. Do we need hegemons, or do we need a peaceful world? And how much will have to be given away at the level of ideas, and so on. Sometimes I actually think, I was thinking the other day, when I often have referred to gated communities, what would it be like if our world and the great cities like Auckland descended into a scene where you had gated communities of the rich, and the people out on the street perceived as those who want what we have and won't give to them? And in the same way, you could get gated conversations. In the international diplomacy, very often, we're getting gated conversations. That is, there are certain things which can't be raised with those who are perceived to be powerful. And that, in a way, is something that will have to change. That is what will give energy once again to the United Nations and its agencies.